The Bible mentions 3 sons of Noah, but the oldest texts speak of a 4th name that was erased. That name disappeared from the official manuscripts, and what it hides could change everything we know for centuries. Scholars accepted the canonical version without questioning it, but the archives tell another story: the apocryphal texts. The scrolls of Qumran and the Semitic oral traditions keep a disturbing secret. There is a bloodline that did not board the ark, a descent that survived the flood by other means. The question that no one asks out loud is this: why was that name removed from the sacred record? It is not a copy error or an accidental omission, but a completely deliberate suppression. The evidence is scattered from Mesopotamia to Ethiopia, from Syria to the Dead Sea Scrolls. But to understand what was hidden, we must first return to the moment when the world was destroyed. Because the flood was not just a punishment, it was also a genealogical cleansing operation without precedent. Genesis describes with precision that Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and apparently no more. However, the Book of Jasher, cited twice in the Old Testament, introduces a disturbing figure. That book mentions an earlier son born before Noah received the divine command to build the ark. His name varies depending on the source, but he appears most frequently as Ner, although some call him Yonit. Then the first contradiction arises: if he existed, why was he not included in the list of canonical Genesis? The researchers of the Masoretic text found traces of editing in verses that describe the family. Those traces suggest that some copyist decided at some point in history to simplify the genealogy. But simplifying a sacred genealogy is not a minor act. It is an intervention with enormous consequences. To understand why, we must understand who that 4th son was and what his concrete existence represented. The Ethiopian traditions preserved in the Book of Enoch speak of a mixed line between humans and celestials. That mixed line produced the Nephilim, the giants of chapter 6, children of the so-called sons of God. However, the Nephilim did not disappear completely with the flood, and that is what the texts do not admit. Because if the 4th son had mixed blood, the genealogical contamination survived within the ark itself. But if he did not board the ark, the question darkens: how did he survive the flood that supposedly covered everything? Mesopotamian texts, especially the Sumerian versions of the flood, mention shelters outside the boat. Some traditions speak of caves in the mountains of Ararat that remained above the floodwaters. Other sources recovered in Tel El Amarna in the 20th century suggest the existence of underground shelters. However, the most disturbing clue does not come from archaeology, but from the linguistics of the biblical texts. In ancient Hebrew, the word used for the survivors of the flood has an unexpected plural form. That plural suggests that not only Noah's family survived, but that there were others unnamed who did. Scholars at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem have debated this point for decades without official consensus. Then, if there were other survivors, the narrative of the flood as a total extinction of the corrupt collapses, and with it collapses the logic of the ark as the only means of salvation designed exclusively by the Creator. But let us return to the 4th son, because his story does not end with the flood, but actually begins there. The Aramean traditions preserved in manuscripts from the 7th century before Christ describe him as the bearer of something. That something was the knowledge of the Watchers, the fallen angels who taught humans forbidden arts. The Book of Enoch details those arts: metallurgy, astronomy, alchemy, magic, and the precise art of war. That knowledge was precisely what provoked divine wrath and triggered the flood according to the sacred narrative. However, if the 4th son possessed it, then that knowledge was not destroyed by the water, but preserved. And that explains something that archaeologists have not been able to justify in any other way: the rise of civilizations. Because after the flood, in an astonishingly short period, Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus Valley appear, civilizations that show a level of astronomical and mathematical sophistication inexplicable if they started from scratch. But if a bloodline with advanced knowledge survived, then that sudden emergence has a cause. The Sumerian texts speak of the Anuna, beings who descended and taught men the art of order. And in those same traditions appears Ziusudra, the Sumerian equivalent of Noah, with a larger family. Ziusudra has more descendants than the 3 canonical sons, and one is described as the bearer of the divine seal. That seal in the Sumerian tradition means having been marked by the gods to preserve the ancient knowledge. Then, the connection between the 4th Hebrew son and the Sumerian tradition is not metaphorical, it is structurally equal. What in one tradition is called forbidden knowledge, in another is called a divine gift, but the function is the same: to preserve a line of continuity between the world before the flood and the world that emerged after the water. However, that continuity was precisely what the canonical text of Genesis wanted to erase from memory. Because a continuity implies that the flood was not a total restart, but barely a pause in something greater. And if it was a pause, then current humanity does not descend only from Noah, but from that parallel and hidden line. Modern geneticists have found something disturbing that fits this hypothesis in a surprising way. In human mitochondrial DNA, there is a genetic bottleneck that occurred approximately 12,000 years ago. That bottleneck indicates that the human population was reduced to a very small number in a limited period, but the disturbing thing is that this event did not produce a total genetic extinction, but a subsequent diversification, and that diversification shows patterns that suggest multiple lines of origin, not a single exclusive family. Geneticists are careful when interpreting this because the data alone do not confirm any text by themselves. But the convergence between genetics, archaeology, and apocryphal texts forms a pattern that is difficult to ignore, because in all the cultures of the world there is some version of the flood with survivors who are not the canonical ones. The Mayas speak of men of corn who existed before the flood and preserved knowledge in sacred caverns. The Hindus narrate how Manu saved not only his family but also sages who were bearers of the eternal Vedas. The Chinese record in their chronicles a flood from which lineages survived that did not descend from the official monarch, and the Greeks in the version of Deucalion mention other survivors who were not created directly by Zeus. The question is no longer whether there was a fourth son, but why all cultures seem to remember something very similar. The most uncomfortable answer is that all those traditions preserve a real memory of something that history denied. But let us return to the Hebrew text, because it is there where the trace of the fourth son becomes more concrete and obscure. The Midrash, the rabbinic literature of biblical interpretation, contains a tradition debated for centuries. That tradition speaks of a son of Noah named Canaan, different from the grandson Canaan mentioned as the son of Ham. Some rabbinic texts suggest that this original Canaan was the fourth son, not the grandson, and was cursed. The curse of Canaan is one of the darkest episodes of Genesis, and its textual justification is not clear. Ham saw his father naked and Noah cursed Canaan, the son of Ham, and not directly Ham, which is illogical, unless Canaan was not simply the grandson, but a figure who represented something older and more threatening. Some scholars propose that the curse was inserted to justify the Israelite conquest of the Canaanite region, but others go further and suggest that Canaan was the code name for the forbidden lineage, the fourth son made blood. Because the Canaanites, according to Genesis itself, were descendants of a line that precedes the distribution of nations. And in Canaan, the Israelites found something that filled them with genuine terror, the Anakim, the giants of Arba. Those giants in Canaan are described as living vestiges of the Nephilim, the same race prior to the flood. However, the flood supposedly had extinguished them all, which generates an irresolvable contradiction, unless a line, that of the fourth son, had survived and established itself exactly in the Canaanite land. Then, the curse of Canaan is not just family dishonor, but the explicit condemnation of an entire genealogy. A genealogy that the text wanted to bury under the narrative, but that emerged in each new generation, because that blood, if it existed, could not disappear just because a compiler decided not to mention it in the text. The Dead Sea Scrolls have provided material that conventional scholars took time to integrate into the debate. In the Book of Giants, found in Cave 4 of Qumran, there appear names of Nephilim that Genesis omits. Among those names there is one that has especially intrigued specialists, Mahaweh, messenger between giants. Mahaweh is described as a liminal being who could move between the human world and the world of the giants, and that being, according to the text of Qumran, survived the flood because his dual nature made him resistant to water. However, the text does not explain how. It only states that Mahaweh crossed the waters and reached unflooded land. That land appears also in Tibetan traditions, in texts of the Bon culture prior to Buddhism itself. In those texts they speak of a physical territory, not spiritual, where the connoisseurs of the ancient world gathered. The most direct connection with the fourth son comes from the Mandaean texts of Mesopotamia, a Gnostic tradition. The Mandaeans preserve a flood in which the spirit Shishlam reveals to a fourth son the route of salvation. That route does not go through the ark, but through an underground path towards caverns, where the knowledge will be kept. The fourth son in the Mandaean version is called Sam Shishlam, the one who bears the name that cannot be pronounced. That name is the true name of God, revealed by the fallen angels to men before the catastrophe. Then, the fourth son is not just a genealogical character, but the guardian of what the flood wanted to destroy, and that makes him the most dangerous figure in the biblical narrative, more than Cain, more than Nimrod himself. Because Cain was banished and Nimrod was confused, but the fourth son simply was eliminated from the record. Erasing someone from a sacred text is the most radical act that a religious tradition can commit in its history. It implies that what that person represented was so threatening that even explicit condemnation was not enough. It was necessary to act as if he never existed, turning him into a ghost whose shadow only appears in marginal texts. And the margins of history are exactly where the most uncomfortable truths find their permanent refuge. Researchers who followed that marginal trace drew a line that connects the fourth son with the Rephaim. The Rephaim are another race of giants in the Old Testament, distinct from the Anakim, but equally feared. In Psalm 88, the Rephaim appear in Sheol as beings who inhabit the threshold between life and death. That liminal condition defines also the fourth son in the Apocrypha, neither completely human nor completely other. However, the Rephaim in Canaan were physically present, warriors of stature and power out of the ordinary, and their territory, Bashan was in the Israelite tradition a threshold to the underworld, a deeply cursed place. The king of Bashan, Og, is the last Rephate mentioned in the Bible, and his iron bed measured 9 long cubits. Og persisted for generations, and that persistence was inexplicable if his lineage did not have some special resistance. Some rabbinic texts from the Babylonian Talmud state that Og survived the flood clinging to the outside of the ark. That image of Og on the hull of the ship while the flood surrounds him is one of the most disturbing of the canon, because it implies that Noah knew of his presence and did not include him, turning the omission into a deliberate decision. And if Noah made that decision, then the genealogy of only 3 sons is also the product of an active will. 2 parallel omissions, Og outside the ark and the 4th son outside the genealogical record of canonical Genesis, both point in the same direction. There was a will to erase an entire line of descent from history. But that line did not disappear because they erased it from the text. It remained alive in the flesh of the peoples who inherited it. And here we come to the most explosive connection, the one that unites the 4th son with the origin of the first civilizations. Because if that line brought the knowledge of the Watchers, the great human inventions have another real origin. Writing. The zodiac, monumental architecture, and bronze metallurgy appear without clear precedents. Archaeologists call this the sudden rise of civilization, and they do not have a satisfactory answer. However, if a line of knowledge survived outside the ark, that sudden emergence has a concrete cause. The bearers of that knowledge settled in Sumer, in Egypt, and transmitted what they had managed to preserve. And they transmitted it not as religion, but as technique, as social structure, as calendar, and as architecture. That is why the first civilizations do not seem to have learned from scratch. They seem to have remembered something already known, but remembering implies that in the world before the flood, that knowledge was common, not secret or reserved. That is exactly what the Book of Enoch describes, an era in which the Watchers taught freely to everyone. However, that free knowledge was what caused the corruption that justified the flood according to the narrative. Then, the flood was not just a punishment of corrupted humans, it was also a knowledge control operation. Those who knew too much were destroyed, but those who could be guided within the framework of obedience were preserved. Noah was the righteous man, the one who obeyed without questioning, the one who did not possess the forbidden knowledge of the angels. His 3 canonized sons were the basis of a new humanity built on oblivion and total obedience. But the 4th son represented continuity with that past, the living memory of what the water wanted to erase, and that is why he could not board the ark. His presence would have turned the flood into a useless act without real effect. However, that he did not board did not mean that he disappeared, only that his story would be told in another way, a fragmented way, scattered in traditions that the guardians of the canonical text never managed to silence. Because knowledge, like water, always finds a crack, even if the stone seems absolutely solid. And the cracks are the apocryphal texts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Mandean traditions, and the Sumerian chronicles. In all those cracks appears the same figure, the one who did not board, the bearer of the hidden name, the eternal guardian. His existence explains why after the flood the world was not a blank slate, but a battlefield. A field where the line of Shem, blessed by Noah, clashed with an older and much more resistant line. That older line is the one that the Israelites encountered in Canaan, in Bashan, in the cities of the giants. And it is the same line that the apocryphal texts trace back to the 4th son, the erased one who never disappeared. And that name, that of the sons of God, is in itself one of the most debated phrases in all of Scripture. Some theologians interpret it as angels, others as human rulers, but the text leaves no room for doubt. The immediate context of Genesis 6 describes beings who took human women and fathered powerful children. Those powerful children, the Nephilim, are the link between the celestial world and the human world before the flood. And if the 4th son was the bearer of that link, then his erasure was not just editorial, it was theologically vital. Because admitting that this blood survived would mean admitting that the border between the divine and the human was never solid. And that border is precisely what biblical monotheism needed to seal to affirm the oneness of God. However, the scriptures themselves leave it open in every mention of giants, in every vestige of the Enoch. Then, the tension is not between faith and science, but between 2 internal versions of the sacred text itself. One version that admits the mixture, the giants, the parallel line, and another that systematically erases it from view. That internal tension is the strongest proof that something real was suppressed, something that left too many traces to escape, because when the editors of a text are skillful, they do not leave traces. But here the traces are everywhere. They are in the curse of Canaan, in the giants of Canaan, in Og of Bashan. In Mahaweh and in Sam Shishlam, all those names and those figures form a constellation that only makes sense if you accept that a star is missing. That missing star is the 4th son of Noah, the one who was erased, but whose light keeps arriving from antiquity. And that light is not a metaphor, it is the concrete trace of a genealogy that traveled from before the flood until today. to the Canaanite cities, to the archives of Qumran, to the Mandaean texts, to the Sumerian chronicles, to the research that gathers all those fragments for the first time in a coherent and verifiable narrative, because historical truth does not live in the texts that are preserved, but in those that were almost destroyed forever. And the most almost destroyed of all is the trace of the fourth son, the character who should not exist, but who did exist. Today, thanks to decades of textual archaeology and comparative analysis, that trace becomes legible and disturbing again. The story of the fourth son is, in reality, the story of everything that humanity has tried to forget about itself. And what humanity tries to forget, as psychology teaches and history confirms, always returns in the end. The fourth son of Noah is not a marginal myth. It is the key that connects the Nephilim with the origin of civilizations. If this mystery shook you, subscribe now to keep unearthing the darkest secrets of history.